So I am a co-chair of the Minnesota delegation, and like was said, my name is Carol Zaagsma, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm pleased to be here with Dave Nuckols, who is the other co-chair of our delegation, and we'll offer a brief overview of General Conference along with some specific things to watch for this year. And then we'll both answer the questions that you have. So be listening for what you're curious about, and there'll be a time to ask those, both online and here for you who are gathered in person. So this year, General Conference will be held April 23rd through May 3rd at the Convention Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. General Conference is the only body in the United Methodist Church that can set official policy and speak for our denomination. It meets every 4 years or each quadrennium, except when there's a worldwide pandemic. The Book of Discipline requires between 600 and 1,000 delegates, half laity and half clergy, with the number of delegates from each annual conference being determined by membership numbers. And so that's why it's so important to do things like your statistical tables every year. For this general conference, we have 862 delegates. We have 55.9% from the United States, 32% from Africa, 6% from the Philippines, and 4.6% from Europe. So let's take a little closer look at our worldwide denomination. Sometimes we think of organizations from the top down, but so much of what happens in our denomination relies on action by annual conferences and their local churches. According to the Book of Discipline, the purpose of the annual conference is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world by equipping its local churches for ministry and by providing a connection for ministry beyond the local church, all to the glory of God. So really, there is so often a perceived disconnect between the decisions General Conference makes and the local congregations and the ministry that's happening there. But at our best, we remember that the reason for all of this is to better equip local congregations for the most important reason we do exist at all, and that's to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. The jurisdictional conferences are a way to organize geographically within the United States. We have 5 jurisdictional conferences: Northeastern, Southeastern, North Central, South Central, and Western. We are in the North Central jurisdiction. It's comprised of the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Northern Illinois, Illinois Great River, Michigan, Indiana, and East and West Ohio annual conferences. Central conferences are a way to organize geographically outside of the United States. We now have the Africa Central Conference, Central and Southern Europe, Congo, Germany, Northern Europe and Eurasia, Philippines, and West Africa Central Conferences. Jurisdictional and central conferences are where bishops are elected. These numbers you see on the slide are from 2016. It shows that our jurisdiction in the North Central jurisdiction has 1,154,944 members, while the Southeastern jurisdiction shows more than twice that, 2,713,928 members. In the central conferences, there's Northern Europe and Eurasia. They have 9,996 members, while Germany has 30,000. Philippines have 233,000. Congo Central Conference reports the most members at 3,081,590 members. Now, in the United Methodist Church, we also have a judicial council of 9 people that serves to determine the constitutionality and the legality of many of the decisions that are made. Our Episcopal leaders all come together to form a council of bishops who are charged with general oversight and promotion of the temporal and spiritual interests of the entire church. Now, at General Conference, we participate in some really inspiring worship, and we also hold some elections, but most of the time is spent dealing with legislation. All the legislation General Conference will act on can be found in what's called the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate. Or, well, technically, this is the advanced edition of the Daily Christian Advocate. So yeah, all these books contain all the legislation. Plus, since the postponement, the window was open to submit new legislation, and so we don't have physical books for that yet. You can download those for free if you wish. It's at resourceumc.org. This general conference, we have 1,099 valid petitions to make decisions on. So there are 13 legislative committees into which all of that legislation is assigned. And each delegate is assigned a legislative committee to serve on. Each legislative committee must vote to adopt, reject, or refer each item they've been assigned. So we are in these legislative committees during the first week of General Conference. And I think you see the list there on the slide. There's 3 different committees that tend to all church and society legislation: a conferences committee, discipleship, faith and order, financial administration, general administration, global ministries, higher ed and superintendency, judicial administration, local church, and ordained ministry. Many of those committees, you'll see similar divisions in the actual book of discipline. That's kind of how you figure out what petitions go into what legislative committee. So the second week of General Conference is when plenary sessions are scheduled, where all delegates are together in one room and debating and voting on all the petitions. So let's take a look at some of the key legislation this time around. It's known affectionately as the 3 R's: regionalization, revised social principles, and the removal of harmful language. So regionalization. Several groups have been preparing legislation for this, including the Connectional Table, which is the visioning body for our denomination, and the Christmas Covenant team, which was a group of Central Conference leaders. Seeing a number of different proposals, the Council of Bishops encouraged these groups to create a joint task force on regionalization in 2023. And out of this collaborative work comes the worldwide regionalization legislation we'll take a look at today. So in our legislation, there are petitions from all these separate groups. And then seeing that is like, how can we collaborate and take the best of all of them? And so that's how the worldwide regionalization legislation came to be. It proposes the formation of 8 regional conferences: Africa, Central and Southern Europe, Congo, Northern Europe, West Africa, Germany, Philippines, and United States. So each regional conference can create administrative roles and regulations for their area. This is what regionalization will allow for. Some examples could be to establish a regional book of discipline, to set standards and qualifications for clergy and specialized lay ministers that take into account access to educational facilities and virtual learning according to the availability in each part of the world. So those requirements might be a little different from region to region. Each region could publish a regional hymnal with adapted rituals in it. There could be adapted structures adequate to missional contexts in each region, such as what committees a local church must have and how many people should be on them, or giving appropriate guidance or rules for financing local church properties that align with banking practices around the world. Our Book of Discipline has rules and regulations related to that. And you know, the banking industry is quite different around the world. So that would be a positive example of how this could be useful. And each region could also change the chargeable offenses and their penalties for their region. So what won't change from regionalization? We will still have a general conference, a judicial council, the council of bishops, and general boards and agencies. We will still share one constitution, the same doctrinal standards, articles of religion and confession of faith, and our theological task. We'll still share the Christian ministry and social principles. Those are the things that would not be adaptable. Some of the benefits to regionalization is that it decenters the United States and it provides equity between regions. It allows greater respect for contextual ministry settings while giving agency and power to make decisions related to ministry and mission in one's area. Of course, with the things that are not adaptable, it also helps us maintain our Wesleyan theology and identity and our strong value of connectionalism across the connection. So the legislation for regionalization contains 8 petitions. One changes the Constitution to create regional conferences. Another of the petitions sorts through the relationship between jurisdictional and general conference so that some committees report back to regional conferences instead of jurisdictional or general conference. There are petitions that change the language throughout the Book of Discipline. Everywhere it says central conference, it should change to regional conference. Several petitions are transitional in that they will create temporary committees to function until all the regions are officially in place. And a final petition empowers the connectional table to evaluate the transition and recommend any additional improvements, while also discerning the things we're not sure about in the moment, like should the U.S. region still have jurisdictions within it? So there's a ratification process required. General Conference would need to approve the constitutional amendments by a 2/3 vote. All the remaining petitions in the regionalization legislation can pass by a simple majority. The amendments need to be ratified then. So the constitutional amendments would have to be ratified by all annual conferences worldwide by also a 2/3 aggregate vote of all members present and voting. So in 2025, that means the Minnesota Annual Conference will have amendments to ratify. So we will have a very important job to do. It also means that all the other conferences around the world are doing the same thing. The Council of Bishops would certify whether or not the constitutional amendments have passed, and then amendments would take effect immediately after ratification. But of course, this process can be very tricky, as sometimes there aren't enough votes around the world for ratification. And you can imagine it would also take time because around the world, all annual conferences are held at a different place on the calendar. And so it'll easily take a year before we know if things are ratified. So that's the first R, regionalization. Our second R is revised social principles. Social principles were first introduced and adopted in 1972. That was over 50 years ago. For these revised social principles, General Board of Church and Society engaged in an 8-year process to craft them. Worldwide regional consultations were happening with more than 4,000 people. There were 11 writing teams made up of people from around the world. There was an online portal for feedback on the first rough draft. They prioritized voices of women and historically marginalized voices to create them, and attempted to use the Wesleyan quadrilateral to resolve conflicting perspectives. The revised social principles are a fresh take on the social gospel and really shows a new way of collaborative work across the denomination. So that's exciting to see, and perhaps a roadmap our whole United Methodist Church will follow in the future. There are some hot spots, though, that will likely see a bit of debate. Those hot spots include the removal of the incompatibility language. You might remember that it's the social principles that say homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And so the revised social principles just simply take that out. The section on marriage defines it between two persons instead of between a man and a woman. And so that's likely to get some debate. There's a social principle around polygamy, which is a factor in several of our central conferences. It's a reality in several of our central conferences. The new social principles don't condone this practice, but they do call for compassionate treatment of wives and children. There is a section on abortion. The revised social principles retain the current language, but strengthen the call for women's health. And y'all are affirming all of these. And then there's also mention about alcohol, and it changes the official stance from abstinence to judicious use. All right. I'm like, should this be like an annual conference where there's no applause or too late for that, right? So that's our second R, revised social principles. Those are also available for download. Unless you were lucky enough, 4 years ago, there were some booklets floating around. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of that document, this would be the social principles that are hopeful to replace the social principles that are currently in the Book of Discipline. So it's a pretty healthy amount of reading. All right, so the third R, removing anti-LGBTQ language and policies in the Book of Discipline. So the Book of Discipline is changed in one form or another every time General Conference gathers, which is every 4 years. This is exactly how all of the LGBTQ prohibitions have made their way into the Book of Discipline. In 1972, we added the phrase that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. In 1976, we saw the addition of some funding restrictions on LGBTQ organizations. In 1984, the phrase was added that self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not to be accepted as candidates or ordained as ministers or appointed to serve the United Methodist Church. In 1996, language was added to the social principles to prohibit homosexual unions to be conducted by United Methodist clergy and to be conducted inside United Methodist churches. In 2004, language was added making it a chargeable offense for ordained ministers for being a self-avowed practicing homosexual or conducting ceremonies that celebrate homosexual unions and performing same-sex weddings. And a big factor in that point in time was also social media since then, because that could be used as some proof for identifying some of those things. But the language in 2004 was added by a vote of 455 for to 445 against. So you can see how evenly divided the body was about that. As you can see, there has been a lot of legislation over the years, and this is just a snapshot of it. Some of it narrowly passing that brings us to where we are today. So removing anti-LGBTQ language and policies. The petitions to remove all this language will be dealt with in 6 different legislative committees. Church and Society 2 will have the incompatibility language, while Finance and Administration will have the funding ban. Faith and Order, Ordained Ministry, Judicial Administration, and Higher Ed all have related petitions to clergy orders and chargeable offenses and things like that. whether it be around same-gender marriage or those ordination standards, or consecrating elected bishops who are LGBTQ. As now we have 2 of those in the Western jurisdiction. And so that has raised questions about what could be done in the Book of Discipline to prohibit that kind of thing. So it could be a challenge to get all of these petitions through their respective legislative committees and for them to be adopted. And so I'm not going to predict the outcome, but I will recognize because of that, because they're all coming in different streams, it's not like just one piece of legislation that says, let's remove all of this. It could be that the next step is similar to how we got here. This piece gets removed and this piece stays. But we're meeting again in 4 years, right? So there's always that. So I think the next slide is for questions. We'll still talk about some what ifs and a few additional pieces of legislation to note, but let's pause now. We'll bring Dave up here. So any questions you have, we'll make an effort to answer them. Questions on regionalization or the revised social principles or anti-LGBTQ language, or just what it's like to be a delegate.
That first slide that you showed, the first R with the 8 pieces of legislation, do those also get considered separately, or are they getting considered as a package, or?
Do you want to take that? I mean, they are individual.
Carol's being nice to me to take the first question. Carol is going to act on those petitions because they're mostly in her committee, which is a conferences committee. So they technically are separate petitions, separate votes, but they'll be considered and discussed as a package, most likely in that committee. There may be a second committee that will have a bite of the apple. That's the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. And then it will come to the floor. They'll record votes for each of them unless they technically put them in a package, but I suspect not.
They are separately numbered petitions, each piece of it. So, but we all know they go together. So it's a little more complicated. The anti-LGBTQ language, some things could be peeled back and others remain. It's far more complicated if that happens for regionalization.
And I just wanted to add, while they're a package with separate votes, there's one of the 8 that's a package of constitutional amendments. So that one has the higher vote threshold and comes to the annual conference. And some of the other petitions are, you could say, contingent upon the amendments passing, but some of them stand alone. So there's some step towards the U.S. being more of a region that can be accomplished without the constitutional amendment. So we can see some momentum on that regardless of the constitutional amendments.
Okay, now that we've had the the people, now that we've had people leave, what are the chances of these passing? I mean, you don't know for sure, but do you have a feel for it?
We don't really know. There are some folks watching the numbers. What we do know is that there have been elected delegates who have, between the time they were elected and now, have left the United Methodist Church, and so they have left their delegations. And many of the conferences have elected new delegates in their place. So, so that we know that that has happened. All of the numbers as far as number of delegates for each conference was set from the earlier, earlier demographics. Yep. And we know that the elections from 4 years ago did show a little bit of progression with progressive delegates because there was organizing post 2019. I think that's pretty, it shouldn't be surprising. But you are watching more closely, so.
Yeah, I'll say this about chances. There's a great likelihood that every petition that we count on for those 3 Rs will have some change in the process. So what exactly comes out is going to be contingent on that process. But the removal of the harmful language is 50% plus 1 majority. The social principles, 50% plus 1. And I feel very confident about them passing in some fashion. And the regionalization is going to be the hardest to get 2/3. And the hardest part of that will be ratification after general conference. So all of you who are members of our annual conference, voting members of our annual conference, would likely see that at the 2025 annual conference. And those of you who are organizers and schemers, I'm looking at you, Minnesota Methodist, there are things we can do to be better prepared to increase the number of votes because it's aggregate. So if we get 2/3 in Minnesota, well, that's nice. But if we have the potential of getting 85%, we should do that to do our part because we're a more progressive. So stay tuned on that stuff. And the final thing I want to say in answer to your question is we have vote counters in the centrist progressive coalition. I work with those folks, and you just heard my opinion. I just listened to an audio of a recent meeting in Africa held by the Africa Initiative. This is there are groups in Africa aligned with the American conservatives, and there are groups that are more aligned or at least in better constructive dialogue with the American centrists and progressives. So the most conservative group in Africa had a presentation given to them by a guy named Tom Lambrecht. He's one of the major leaders of the conservative movement in the United States. He was walking through the numbers for the African audience, and he basically said the centrists and progressives should be able to get their way on all the majority requiring legislation, and it's the regionalization with the Constitution that is going to be the battleground, in his opinion.
Actually, I think you've answered my question a little bit, but do you want to do just a little bit more detail in the whole mess of the delegates are what, the 2020 delegates? Right? And they got carried over but the proportions are based on the church in 2016, right? So even if we've lost a lot of churches and people in the Southeast jurisdiction, they still have more delegates, don't they? And just, can you talk about that? And then I guess the other thing would be, how are people being able to get visas to come from the central conferences? So.
So you've heard that we've lost 25+ percentage of our churches, roughly those numbers. But the representation is not straight proportional to your memberships. It's a more complicated and boring formula. And every annual conference, no matter how small, gets at least 2, and the rest are proportionate. But it's not just proportionate on members, it's clergy. And so we would have fewer delegates if we were counting over again, but we didn't, you know. So we have the same numbers from 2020 based on a census, you know, a few years before that. Those are our numbers. Well, we've lost some people. So what does that mean? Well, some of the delegates have left to go to the GMC and they're not there, but alternates have come up to replace them. And some of the people who intend to leave have stayed around to be in the action at this general conference. Ironically, this audio that I made reference to, Kent, they count 65 traditionalists of the 450, 60, 70, 480 Americans. So 60 traditionalists hanging around from America. They reckon they had 160 American traditional votes in St. Louis. We'll have a relative handful of delegations in America that won't be 100% represented, because if you didn't have enough alternates, there'll be some missing spots. And in Africa, the real problem is getting visas. They were 30 persons shy in St. Louis, and they'll probably be 70 persons shy in Charlotte. Again, I'm referencing the numbers I heard on the conservative call. We still don't know.
We have heard from the general secretary that necessary letters have been issued, except for those that they didn't have location to send them to. So that seems like the question about visas is a flashpoint that's maybe casting some doubt on the legitimacy of general conference meeting, and that seems like a questionable tactic. Other questions?
I think I've heard, about the numbers of churches that were disaffiliating in the US, but I was just wondering if you could comment on what about the rest of the world? What kind of disaffiliation numbers have they occurred outside the US?
I'm going to be the numbers guy.
Yeah.
So the provision that was passed in St. Louis to ease up on the trust clause. The trust clause is the part of church law that means the churches that you go to are owned by or held by the whole denomination. It's no matter how many years you spent on trustees, it's not your building, really, according to our policy. And that provision was pretty much only applied to the US, and there was some arcane reason for it that I don't understand, but even the conservatives say, yeah, that's valid. And so it was open season until last December for churches in the US to consider leaving, and a quarter plus did. Central conferences already have a way to leave that's in the discipline. 8 annual conferences in Russia are currently going through that process under that paragraph. Another annual conference in Bulgaria didn't go through any conference official process, but an overwhelming majority of them at their annual conference meeting said, we want to leave, and they overruled the bishop who said, well, there's not a way to do that, just wait. They overruled that, and there's no fighting that. And there have been other kind of renegade attempts to do that. A number of churches in Kenya were approved to leave at their annual conference meeting, with the majority wanting them to do that. So there have been some few in every part of the world, but not much. And the big push is from the conservatives is to give a fresh approach to disaffiliation. And it would encourage a lot of people to leave. A majority of the delegates in the Philippines, it said, are saying, we don't want you to give our churches a means to leave, because they have no reason to leave. Even though some want to, those delegates are asking us, don't give us your problem. And likewise, it seems that a majority of the delegates in Africa are saying, don't give us your problem. The numbers in Africa are highly contested, whether it's a majority one way or another. A nice thing with regionalization, then we don't have to make that decision for them. But that's the state of play on that.
So you may have heard how unfair that was, that central conferences don't have a way to leave, but it's not true. They do have a way to leave, and we're beginning to see official statements put out by a number of caucuses in the central conferences saying, we do not support any additional efforts at disaffiliation legislation. So they're being quite clear about that. So if you've heard otherwise, with some certain YouTube video, you might just question its validity. And so there's a question there, and then one in the middle here.
First of all, I want to say thank you. This is by far one of the clearest presentations I've ever heard about general conference. And I've lived through a lot of them, so thank you very much. I want to just shift it a little bit about finance, because the disaffiliation pieces relate to finance, I think, correct? And is there any sense of what might happen to the kind of the administrative oversight of the United Methodist Church at that point? How much cutting is there?
There'll be a quick mention of that coming up, but Dave serves on the Finance Legislative Committee. So
we'll have another Q&A after the next portion.
So we'll hold that for that. I do want to just clarify that in Minnesota here, we had 7.5% of our churches disaffiliate. That isn't proportional to the membership, because many of those were small churches. And so we fared much better than the 25% nationwide. But there is an impact, and we'll talk about that.
I've read that the traditionalists are wanting to see a process opened up for the rest of the areas that was like the disaffiliation process from 2019. And that what they are saying is that if that is granted early in general conference, they'll pack their bags and go home. But if that is not granted, then they will be sticking around and, lobbying the delegates to vote down regionalization. So it's kind of like, these traditionalists that have already started their new denomination are not leaving us alone. And that's just really frustrating.
Thanks for your comment. Any other questions? Because, we all kind of have to measure what's happening against our own ethic. And I think, Judy, what you said is good.
Yeah.
It's important.
Is either of you or anybody know for the Dakotas and Iowa what those percentages are with the disaffiliation? Just out of curiosity from our neighbors, or Wisconsin?
I don't think I have those on the top of my head.
It's higher. Right. And the churches, out of their larger churches,
Right
more
here.
of,
For our online audience.
Most of our churches that left were smaller. In the Dakotas, they have a number of large churches that left. I'm not sure what the final percentage is, but we are in some sense going to be sharing their pain because we share a bishop and we do a lot of things together, but I can't put a specific number on it.
From my recollection, both were closer to the national average.
Hi, my question is, what has kept you going and where do you find hope? Each of you, seriously, it will help us to hear that.
You want to do that first or you want me to?
I want you to.
Okay. What's kept me going? I think that everything I've done in ministry is deeply tied to my sense of call and being a part of shepherding our denomination into a more inclusive future is has been a part of that from the beginning. And so, you know, I often say, even being a Christian is not always easy, and we were never promised that by Jesus. And so, through the hard and through the easy and through the sunny and through the rain, it just is, and that's what keeps me going anyway.
I got into this because of my kids. So that's how I get into it. I think about them. They're not going to run back to the Methodist Church. But that's how I started. Somewhere along the way, I felt like a Liam Neeson with a certain set of skills. And when I've thought about stopping, I thought that wouldn't be fair. And then the last thing I would say is I have a psychological problem with what's called escalation of commitment. And here I am.
All right, shall we take one more question, then we'll jump into the rest and pick up any remaining questions. So Nancy's got a question up here.
I'm sorry, I had to step out, church stuff. There, you had that whole list of like things that aren't changing or things that keep us together. And at the bottom, it was like our theological task. And it seems to me, thinking back to that, there it is. It seems our theological task isn't something that how we interpret scripture. Like there are, to me, a lot of theological issues or how that's interpreted that this keeps going back to is biblical interpretation. And so I don't think that that's helpful to see that like what won't change, that our theological task, there's different interpretations of that is at heads. And I'm wondering where you're hearing clarity or addressing that at some place is happening in all of this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. It hasn't been asked yet, so just reassure you of that while you were out. But paragraph 105 of the Book of Discipline sorts out our theological task, and that's where you'll find something you know as the quadrilateral. And I know you know this too. But so my answer to your question is I see the theological task as the process, not the answer. And so I think for the process to hold us together across our connection, that we look primarily at scripture, but also elevate our understanding of tradition, reason, and experience to come to an understanding of God. That's helpful framework around the world, no matter what conclusion we get to, because the process itself invites different conclusions because our experiences have been different.
And just to add, the way to understand Carol's slide, or that's the vision of regionalization of the things that we'll continue to hold in common as a global church. So we'll hold the social principles in common, but here we're talking about changing them at General Conference as a global church. So the processes through which those things evolve are for us. This is not closing any doors, but what are we trying to change in this current difficult moment to move to regionalization is more limited.
Right, great. Shall we move to the next slide? So what if? Some of you have this question. What if the 3 R's are adopted? And so that we know that the approved legislation would become effective January 1st of the following year. However, if regionalization is adopted, those constitutional amendments are going to need to be ratified by 2/3 aggregate vote. And what that means is every single vote counts. And then you add up all of the single votes at the end. And if 2/3 said yes, then it passes. So that's what aggregate vote means. And that's why it would be helpful if 85 or 90% of the Minnesota Annual Conference provided a little buffer for another conference that might be at, 60% instead of 66%. The revised social principles, if they're adopted, especially if they're adopted, and we're running out of time before General Conference, but if they're adopted, you might want to head up a study group at your church to become familiar with them. The removal of the LGBTQ language, well, clergy are still going to be able to discern which weddings they preside at. So you may also have heard that that would not be the case, and that is wrong. Clergy always have the ability to say yes or no to a wedding they're asked to preside at. That comes from the separation of church and state. So, so the legislation would be January 1st, except for the constitutional amendments that will take longer than that. If the 3 R's are not adopted, I would want you to remember that the Minnesota Annual Conference has already set its course and will continue to live into our stated mission, vision, and values. Can we make an aggregate word out of that and just say one word for all 3? For our mission, vision, and values. So be encouraged by that. And I will also say that we are not the only annual conference has done this kind of work. And so across the United States, there are many conferences that are heading in the same direction. And so we have allies with us. We have good conversation partners to help find the way. The Council of Bishops also intends to call for a 5-day special session of General Conference in 2026. They have not called for that yet because they're waiting to lay out the specific purpose once they see what happens at General Conference. And so while we usually make decisions every 4 years, it looks like there may be a special session in 2026 that will be useful and helpful during this transitional time to meet again to be able to make some decisions. So what else? Many of the recommendations that we're seeing demonstrates a commitment to adjusting our current reality. So just like Minnesota Conference has done, saying this is who we are, this is where we're going, we're seeing some kind of adjustments across the whole church to adjust to the reality of today. The proposed budget of just under $347 million, that's for the whole quadrennium. It represents a 43% reduction from the previous budget. And so that's part of what you were asking about. The 2016 budget was just over $604 million. Denominational leaders mostly affected are generally upbeat as they witness innovation and revisioning as a result of these adjustments. But there's still honestly some caution and some work yet to be done in reconfiguring our general boards and agencies and in understanding these impacts to the budget and how that will impact the funding for Episcopal support. There's a new retirement plan in the legislation called the Compass Plan that would replace the current CRISP plan. The Compass Plan is a defined contribution plan, and many of you in the working world today will know what that is, because that's probably what you have. The CRISP plan has a defined benefit, otherwise known as a pension, along with the defined contribution plan. So it was kind of a both and. And so the new recommendation is to move exclusively to a defined contribution. And it would encourage clergy to be setting aside part of their salary for their retirement, along with a flat $150 per month contribution by the church, plus a 3% match, or a 3% plus a 4% up to 4% match. So it's all based on the contribution that the clergy makes. So the Compass Plan, just kind of shifts the thought and responsibility for retirement planning. In 2016, General Conference authorized a jurisdictional study committee to consider the number of bishops needed in each jurisdiction. So they're recommending a reduction to the number of bishops in each jurisdiction, which has led to actions such as what the North Central jurisdiction has already done, which is to have East and West Ohio plan for sharing a bishop instead of having one for each conference, while Northern Illinois and Wisconsin are doing the same thing, much like Minnesota and the Dakotas did some years ago. Our boards and agencies have been reducing staff, while the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry and the General Board of Global Ministries are experimenting with the same general secretary or leader over two of those agencies. So kind of like a 2-point charge. Elections are an important part of General Conference, as that is where the Judicial Council members are named, and as well as University Senate leaders. There are 19 disaffiliation related petitions submitted to General Conference. I haven't personally seen a lot of enthusiasm in United Methodist circles for extending the disaffiliation process that was laid out in paragraph 2553. That was the one that expired last year, like Dave mentioned. And there have been a number of public statements that are seeing just in the last couple of days, Central Conferences saying we don't need, and in fact, we oppose any further legislation related to disaffiliation. So with over 1,000 petitions, we can't possibly do justice to all of the very important issues during today's presentation. For example, there is legislation that would allow sacramental authority for deacons. There's a request for Westpath to divest from bond investments in contracts supporting Israeli aggression. And since all the things in the Book of Resolutions is different than this one, I didn't show it to you yet. All the things in the Book of Resolutions needs to be reaffirmed every 8 years. Well, guess what? It's been 8 years since the last General Conference, so every single page in here is up for renewal as well. So there are lots of things you would be interested in here, and just not enough time today to tend to them all. So I thank you for your understanding and grace if we didn't touch on all the things that are most near and dear to your hearts. So what can you do? I bet you're wondering. One thing is to seek information from reliable sources. There's an official General Conference webpage, and you find that on the resourceumc.org website. So it's kind of a long address, but if you just, search for resourceumc.org General Conference page, it'll pop up. There's other reliable sources, umc.org, umnews.org. Both of those are great. You can follow the Minnesota Annual Conference on Facebook, on our website. There will be links during the second week of general conference to plenary when you can watch the debate that's going on, watch worship. So look there for ways to connect with what's happening. You can, let's see. I would encourage you not to be shy. Talk with others in your church about general conference. Consider forming a small group to read and discuss the revised social principles. Maybe you want to get together with a few friends and watch some of the live stream. And certainly pray for the delegation and the Minnesota Conference, our local congregations, all of our bishops, and general conference as a whole. So our delegation, Dave Nuckols is our lay delegate, and I'm the clergy delegate. Becky Boland is the first reserve lay delegate, while Wu Jae Eam is the first reserve clergy delegate. The delegation is rounded out with laypersons Walker Bro, Cindy Sofferer, and Shirley Durer, along with clergy Jeff Ozan, Susan Mullen, Henry Dolape, and Donna Dempey-Wolf. So I'm grateful to be on this journey to general conference with them. We do have a large delegation for just 2 seats to fill in general conference, but this is what enables us to have wonderfully diverse representation in our preparations for it. As we have laity and clergy from all around the state of Minnesota, we have deacons, United Women of Faith, Earth Keepers, members from Central Conference Connections, and members of our delegation with deep knowledge of Robert's Rules of Order. So the diversity present, the diversity present in our delegation really helps greatly with the networking and also with the strategic work that's required. So if you have any questions, there is an email address there. Oh, I almost wore that shirt again today. I'm glad I didn't. All right, so just email that email address if you like, and we have a little more time for more questions.
And I'd like to make a couple comments while our delegation picture is up. I want you guys to know that in the process of doing delegation work, some generative work has been done that has impact before we get to legislation. In 2021, we had a virtual delegation meeting of the North Central jurisdiction. And there was a covenant, was it?
For beloved community.
Beloved community covenant that was wholly in concert with our 2019 aspirational vision from Minnesota. Carol was one of the lead authors on that very important work. We were the only jurisdiction that met virtually. But in 2022, every jurisdiction met. And I like to think they picked up some of what we started in 2021. We had a resolution that was introduced at all 5 jurisdictions. Slightly differently worded in some places, but basically the same resolution calling for regionalization. That was part of our beloved community covenant. That passed overwhelmingly. There was a resolution that was offered by the Queer Delegate Caucus. We have, is it 100 queer delegates at General Conference? I mean, it's
more than there have ever been, but I don't know what the current total is.
Elections that happened after St. Louis for 2020 brought forward a lot of great queer delegate voices. They were organized. They have been super constructive, bringing their voice. As an ally, I can tell you sometimes the queer voices are more reasonable than the allies. Because we want to overdo some things, but Walker is an active participant in that and had something to do with, I think, that resolution. Did you both go on the floor to talk about that in our jurisdiction? So we have a delegation that kicks ass. And thank you. And just to know if you know Shirley Durr, and you know her well enough to pronounce her name, right? She is being commissioned as a deaconess. We have a program, Deaconess Home Missioner. They get commissioned at General Conference, and it's going to be a great moment for her there.
She will also be recognized at annual conference as well. So you don't have to go all the way out to Charlotte to celebrate that.
No, but I think our communications team is aware and gonna keep an eye on that. So maybe that'll be some of the live stream you want to pick up. Other questions you have? I've got one back there and then Mariah up here.
It occurred to me as you were talking that judicial council is also elected every half the class, every other general conference. So do we elect all 9 this time? What's happening with that?
Oh, you know that?
I know the waffly answer that you'll get from a bishop, which is they're nominating sufficiently that we could elect all 9, but somehow they're still discerning whether we elect half of the class or all. But those nominations are already made. We don't have all the names until we get to General Conference. And referencing then again, Tom Lambrecht, he thinks they have no chance of electing judicial council members. We've gone back and forth over the years, and generally, not every time, but generally we take it on the chin on some of those elections. This will be different. Yeah.
Given all that is before us to do, how do they manage the time to get to it all? Or is there going to be a lot of legislation that just isn't acted on, or you don't get to a point of voting, or yeah.
It wasn't that long ago where they made the rule you had to do everything.
2016, last time we met.
So I guess we don't really have a lot of historical experience with which to draw from. But I would say that legislative committees have to be sharper about the recommendations to sort through. And honestly, there are a lot of duplicate type of petitions in there. And so you can't really adopt all of the approaches to regionalization. You have to pick the one that you're going to go with and then work on that. So, and there are committees that are in charge of the ordering and pacing and all of that. So,
Do you want to talk about the consent calendar?
well, would you like to talk about the consent
Sure.
calendar?
There is also a consent calendar at General Conference, which if petitions get a certain threshold and there's some other qualifications, they can just go onto the consent calendar and we don't have to discuss each of them individually. And that greatly helps speed the process along.
And something can always be pulled off of that if there's enough traction to do that. But, you know, those are the kinds of things that help with time management. But I guess, you know, I'm as curious as you are about how that's going to look.
I'll add to this process. And first, to explain what Walker was saying, we have committees 1 week, and then the next week is plenary where everybody votes what comes out of whatever has come out of committee. And that the consent calendar is the thing in between those two. Going back to 2001, where North Central jurisdictional delegates got really organized, that has continued not just in 2022, but today. And we have 40 plus person steering committee made up of progressives and centrist. RMN is very well represented there, and probably has the most muscle in terms of doing the legwork. So your organization has a big voice in that. And they have identified all the delegates that they think of as centrists and progressives. They moved forward, grooming those delegates to be prepared to vote together on regionalization, removal of the language, and the social principles. And one of the things that they've done is organize delegates to be on Zoom calls together. So all the stay UMC delegates on a committee, without having the WCA people having to be there, are meeting informally, going through lists of petitions. So we've started more work than before. I would make a plug. Becky Bolin on our delegation is one of the, they call them committee stewards, helping to do that work for conferences committee. So we'll get through it.
I would add to that with the organizing work that I've been part of. There is no pressure to vote as a block. The purpose is really to inform and allow us to think through, well, what are the ramifications of this and that? And so we're just coming into general conference far better prepared. But there hasn't been any, requirement. It's just to help us understand better and work better together, so that when we get together in Charlotte, we'll have some relationships and history behind it. And so,
could I just go back to slide 14? I want to make two comments here. These are the things that we aim to get rid of when we say remove the harmful language from the discipline. We're taking the discipline to neutral. All the harm goes away, the prohibitions go away. Taking it to neutral so that it can be a global document. And really the problems we've encountered are largely addressed by just removing, but we'll have an opportunity as a region to move to affirming language, which many of us are eager to do. And if you look at the resolutions we passed at those 5 jurisdictional conferences, you'll see what that means, and you can be proud of it. But what I want to say, 72, the incompatibility statement, it sucks that it's still in the book, but we don't live by that in Minnesota. We took care of it in 2019. For us, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of communal covenant, this is how we are going to live. The funding restrictions still exist, and they're a pain in the butt because the GCFNA asks the general secretaries tricky questions, and some of the secretaries are uncomfortable about that process. But nonetheless, RMN got a grant from, I think, one of our general agencies last year, working on maybe the Sunday school curriculum. So as a church, we're finding ways around. The prohibition on ordination, again, doesn't happen in Minnesota anymore. Presiding same-sex unions, no one gets in trouble for that anymore. I went to Tyler Sitt's wedding a few weeks ago. It was an impressive numbers of district superintendents there. And there were people taking pictures, posting on Facebook. People didn't want to do that 8 years ago. So through all this list, we're going to do our work as delegates to help the country and the globe, but we've made so much progress here. And what you can see through 2022, and if you know what to look for, you'll see it at General Conference. Tremendous progress is being made. We have more to do. I usually like to ask for RMN contributions at these kinds of things. I didn't say that I'd be doing that, and I'm not. I'm saying after General Conference, I'd really like people to step up the giving to RMN because there's work that they need to continue to do. But if you're one of the persons that have significant means, or a church with significant means, we're at $10,000 short in our translator budget. So we've contracted with some translation people. The number of translators that they will employ during the week is dependent on raising the full amount. So if you have some part of $10,000 that you might be interested in giving, I would be happy to talk to you.
So Dave's not going to talk about money, but we do have a free will offering, and I believe we're doing part of that to RMN. That is correct. Yes. So part of that money will go to RMN in support of this work and all of the work that they do. Yes.
Anybody bring a briefcase full of cash? All right, any other questions for Dave and me? Thank you for your attention, having us today. I think we have a question here.
That last bullet point, what did that mean? I may have missed it. I was out in the hall.
The last bullet
The
point.
2004. What does that mean? The chargeable offenses instated?
That it made it a chargeable offense to be, I think, let me just, to perform weddings and, so a chargeable offense is something that, it's kind of like, a lawsuit. I'm going to charge you because you did some offensive behavior. And so that offensive behavior would have been being a self-avowed practicing homosexual, or presiding at weddings. The previous language was unions, because it was after weddings became legal that they had to change that. So, yeah. Oh, what's the penalty? So when you get charged with something like that, the penalty can be up to and including surrendering your credentials, so losing the job. And I think that was that when some of the petitions like mandated that, or some of the efforts in 2019 was like, if you do this, then this is what will happen. So there was significant effort to really ratchet down on those punishments.